we're going to study Bamidbar for a little bit. It's a rather interesting chapter. It's a lot of names and figures and a lot of directions. So I tried to go and look at it from 4 points of view. I did the simple, which is just a basic look. Then I've done what we'd call a remez, and we're going to start seeing hints that are in the text, and then we'll go deeper into the text, all the way down to the secrecy of the text, because there are some rather interesting words that are used and choices of words. So anyway, be prepared. Joe loves it when I do random digression. He just thinks I'm off my rocker, but anyway, we'll do it anyhow, just for Joe. So Bamidbar, in the wilderness or in the desert, depending on how you want to look at it. But again, Bamidbar is also, if you look at the word, you find a word within a word. And the word that I'm looking for is deber. And that's the word to speak. So you're going to speak in the desert is what it amounts to. Now, this book is also called lots of other things. It's called Sefer HaPekadu, which is the idea of countings. And it's also the idea, the Christian idea of numbers, because there obviously are a lot of numbers in our story. But as we go through it today, I want us to look and note that, first off, this is always taught the days, the week prior to Shavuot. This is the Sunday or Saturday message that they go through as they talk about this whole thing. So this is an over and over again kind of a text. And so it runs the gamut in how people look at it. Now, Shavuot is the equivalent for a Jew of marrying God. That's what the concept is behind it, because they signed their contract on Shavuot. They break the contract before they even have it down the mountain to be signed. But the idea is that this is when the contract is first offered to them, and they accept. What we hear, we shall do. Now, the Midrash, according to one source, the Shir Hasharim Rabbah, the night before giving the Torah, the Jewish people did what anyone might do for that night before they have a big ceremony. They went to sleep early. The only problem was that when they went to sleep early, they didn't get up early. They got up late. In fact, God was waiting for them at the mountain when they finally did get up and move, which is part of the reason why it was in the first century, a man named Shimon Bar Yochai, who was the supposed author of the Zohar, said to them, we need to make up for what we've done. How can we do that? Well, it's obvious. We study all night. That way we're awake in the morning. And so they began the process in the first century. Now, remember, this is 1800 years later, after the fact. But yet that's what they began the process. Now, it became much easier in the 16th and 17th century because they came to America and they found coffee. And so they could easily take the coffee back to where they were at. And so they obviously had caffeine so they could stay awake for the whole night. But there was other things that were going on. One of the things that I found fascinating about this is the fact of, let's go to the text first. Verse 1, chapter 1. Hashem spoke to Moses. Okay, here's a trivia. Hashem, now normally is used in place of Yud K Vav K. But if you were to spell the name Hashem, you would use Hey, Shem, Mim. How do you spell Moses? Just the opposite. It's almost as though Moses is talking to Moses. In other words, they're in each other's mind. Remember, Moses had the opportunity that no one else has ever had, and that's to speak with God face to face. And so here's Moses speaking in the wilderness of Sinai. And again, interesting, Sinai comes from the root to mean hate. So in the middle of hate, in the middle of nowhere, God is talking to Moses, saying to Moses, we need to do something. Well, what do we need to do? Well, we're at the tent of meeting because now the tabernacle is up. And on the first of the second month, in the second year after the Exodus, so it's the first day of the second month. The month would have been ER. So it's in the first day of that month that they are now meeting and going through this process. The tabernacle has been functioning for a month at this particular point in time, and everything seemed to be functioning. And so he goes on from there to say in verse 2, take a census of the entire assembly of the children of Israel according to their families, according to their fathers' household, and by the number of the names, and that's key, by the number of the names, every male according to their head count. And that's an interesting word. From 20 years of age and up. Well, the Midrash says that up meant 60. So the characters are anywhere from between 20 and 60 years of age. Everyone who goes out to the legion of Israel. You shall count them according to their legions, you and Aaron, but you're not by yourselves. You're going to have in verse 4, and with you shall be one man from each of the tribes, a man who is a leader of his father's household. So technically, there's going to be a count taken. And in this count, Moses, Aaron, and as they go from camp to camp, one of the leaders of that camp is going to be involved in this count. Now, we always identify this count or the idea of this count with the taking of the half shekel, which is a good thing because that's what they did. They took a half shekel from everybody in the course of the counting. But that may not be exactly what happened here, nor what was going on. So we're going to have to go into it. Now, notice they're in Sinai. They're in the middle of nowhere. And again, the idea is the fact that this is a spiritual count. It is not God already knows the number of people that are there. He didn't need to have everybody simply stand out and we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4. He knew who was there. This count has some other purpose. And so we have to look at what's the spiritual contents for this whole thing. Well, first off, we know it's in the desert or in the wilderness. We know that this whole thing is about learning. The Torah is about learning, teaching, understanding. That's what we're going for. So this is an idea of learning something. Now, Shimon Bar Yochai starts the idea that we will learn all night. So the concept is, how does one prepare to learn? Well, the first idea is that you find yourself alone. By alone, that has connotations. Now, you don't have to go out into a wilderness to be alone. You can go into a study or some other place, but the concept is that you need to separate yourself if you're really going to study. And if you're going to study with others, then you need to make sure you're all separated from somebody else. So it is just you that are speaking together. So you're preparing yourself for what's about to happen. Now, all they were going to do was count the people, but there was a preparation that had to be involved. So there was more to it than just simply the fact 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, the idea goes along that a person, when he goes to study, first off, he vacates his mind of all of the other things, all of the other distractions, and he does that partially by going into his own. But at the same point in time, as you're beginning to do this, it's about the idea of eliminating everything else in your mind. This is about the count. Make sure that that's what's going on. And everybody had to be active when they came to their camp, when they came to their tent. We should always put ourselves in a proper setting in order to study Torah. That's obvious. But not only that, but this happens to be Shavuot. This happens to be a special time. Now, in first of ER is just simply the counting of the Omer. That's what would have been going on. So in the second year, maybe that's what they were beginning to do or should have been doing at that point in time. It's about the idea that when one studies, one prepares himself to influence the world. That's why you're supposed to study. You study to show yourself approved, of course, but the idea is by showing yourself approved is how you present yourself and how you present God to the rest of the world. That's what we constantly have to think about and what we always have to be doing. So I want to look at this from another perspective. First off, let's go back to the nuclear families here. There seems to be a study that's going on, spiritual wilderness. Before we go any farther, I want to say thanks to Rod for allowing me to be a part of NETIV. Because up until then, people like Bobby and Lori and Mary and I, we studied together. We were fortunate. There were enough of us together that we could actually create a group. But many people study alone. They have no group around them. And so NETIV, if nothing else, serves as that desert place where we can all come and we can all study together and we can begin to learn. I know Peggy's in Florida. There's not too many of us that are going to be near where Peggy lives. We're just different. And Joe's in Michigan. Of course, everybody knows Michigan's God's country. The only problem is God's the only one who wants to live there. But beside that, the idea is the fact that we're in a special place. Now, as the story goes, we know that he starts out at the tent of meeting. We don't know all that is really said. We just know that what they talked about was this counting. So I put into my sanctified imagination, everybody has one, I used my sanctified imagination to think about what are some of the things that they must have been going through their minds as they were at this point. It doesn't seem as though they understood or knew that it was coming. It was just that it happened. And so they're now preparing quickly for what's about to happen. You know, in those days at Sinai, it was a wilderness. It was barren. There was nothing there. There was nothing there but them and the tent of meeting. And that was the key to what was going on, was the tent of meeting. Now, they were all there because of the divine providence. They were following God where God would have them to go, which is the same thing that you and I do. We want to follow God. That's our choice. That's our goal. And by following God, we draw closer to him. Now, this particular count on this particular day is the third or fourth count that God has taken. Now, when they crossed out of Egypt, God took a census. How many were there? When they got to the land and the golden calf, they took a census after the golden calf because they wanted to find out how many survived. Now, after that, they counted again the numbers. Well, they counted before the golden calf, then they counted after the golden calf. And then they came to this point, and now they're counting again. And they'll count again at the end of the chapter, or at the end of the book of Bamidbar. 5 counts. What do you expect to learn from the 5 counts? Now, if you look at it closely, and I'm not going to let you read it all, but this is the understanding. We are told that at this count, there will be 603,550 men between the ages of 20 and 60. We also know that there will be 22,273 firstborn. We also know that the Levites weren't counted with this group, but the Levites account for 22 more thousand. That's in a separate counting altogether. And we also know that the Levites were broken down into groups of 7,500 for the Gershonites, and there were 8,600 of the Noahides, and there were 6,200 of the Merari clan. Now, all of this figures up, and we know that the largest tribe was 74,600. And Manasseh was the smallest tribe. Judah was the largest, by the way. Manasseh was the smallest tribe, and it had 32,200. So we total up to 603,550. That's what's going on in their tallies. But that wasn't enough, because you see, they're also going to find themselves arranged. God is going to arrange the people into camps around the tabernacle, around the tent of meeting. And so each one is going to have a specific place. So if you want to turn over to chapter 2, and I want you to look at the second verse, is really where I want you to go. God now lays out for them, this is how I want you to be positioned around the tent of meeting. First off, I want each man by his banner. Now, each man, meaning each clan, each group, Judah by its banner, Reuben by its banner, Dan by its banner, all of them will be surrounding a banner. When I went to Israel, that was one of the neat things that I saw when I was passing through different places. I would see road signs, and on the road sign would be, this is the tribe of Benjamin, and they would have a wolf on it. Or they would, I was in Judah, and it was a lion on it. And I was in Dan, and there was an eagle there. Each time I was moving it just took me back to this section, because that was the way that they were going to be divided. So they're all going to be divided. First off, they're going to be identified by a color. Now, the color was the same color that was on the breastplate of the ephod that the high priest wore. So each one had their own color. Not only does each one have their own color, but they also have their own symbol. And their symbol came by way of Joseph and Jacob. There was an understanding that they had as to whom they were. And so each one has its own. Now, some will be on the east side, some will be on the west side, north and south, all around. Closest to the tent of meeting, closest to that will be those that are the Levites. And the Levites will set in 3 clans on 3 sides. And then the front side will be where Moshe and Aaron and his 2 sons will be. So we have a center, we have a first ring, and then we have a second ring. And then we have a third ring. At least I have in my sanctified imagination, because you see, I don't believe all of the people had converted to Judaism. They were still people outside that camp. And so there was a constant set of circles that were there. The idea brings to mind, well, it was not my idea, it was God's idea. You see, there's a picture in the book of Ezekiel, the 1st chapter. And in Ezekiel, the 1st chapter, we learn about the throne of God. Now, the throne of God is not on the ground, but it's a part of a chariot. And the chariot is surrounded by angelic bands. And some of those bands are actually the chariot itself, the Corvim, the cherubs. And then there's the Ophanim. Those are the circle, the wheels that are on the bottom of the chariot. Constantly, there's all of these angels around it. And in the presence on the tabernacle, that same thing is happening. All around, we find not angels, but we find groups, the clans of Israel. God is married to these people. He is bringing them as close as he can to himself. They're gathered around him on all 4 sides. Each one has their own place that they're going to be in. Now, excuse me. So the arrangement is, Rabbi Avraham ben Ezra would tell us there were signs on each of the 4 main standards. The sages said that on Reuben's standard, there was a man who was decorated with mandrakes. On Judah's standard, there was a form of a lion, to which Jacob had compared him. And Ephraim's standard was the figure of the ox, which is actually Joseph's sign. But again, remember, Manasseh and Ephraim are split between the tribe of Joseph. And finally, the last one is the tribe of Dan, which is the figure of an eagle, making the 4 signs on the 4 main standards like the 4 figures that the prophet Ezekiel saw on the chariot. Now, as you go through this, then, it begins to go into the idea that this, well, let me read another Parsha section. This was from Midrash. It's Bamidbar Rabbah. And it says, and just as the Holy One, blessed be he, created 4 directions in the universe, so he surrounded his throne with 4 living creatures. And high above them all was the throne of glory. And the Holy One, blessed be he, told Moses to arrange the standards in a manner corresponding to those directions. So everybody is seated in a position as they were before. Now, in the book of Genesis, remember, Jacob was taken back to the land to be buried at Hebron. And when he went, he had a command for his sons. He told his sons, I want you to stand on each of these sides of my coffin. Lo and behold, they were the same directions that are given here. Judah was to be the one to the east. We go through all of them. The same thing. God is a pattern maker, and it's helpful to actually begin to see the pattern. Okay, so everybody's organized by those patterns. Now, in the last count that's going to come at the end, we're going to find out that the tribe of Simeon actually lost 22,000 people. And I will bring that up because of the fact that these camps were balanced. There was an equal number or an apparent equality in the numbers of people on each side of this whole thing. So as we're going through then, I have another thought. Go back to chapter 1. And I want to look at a word. This is where we go deep, and this is where Joe usually goes after me. So let's go there so Joe has something to think about. Here's the story. In chapter 1, looking at verse number 2. Now, we've talked about this in the organization. Now, according to their families, so they're by family, Judah's family, Dan's family, Reuben's family, all the families. According to their fathers, now they're broken down into smaller groups. And by the number of the names of every male, according to their head count. Head count. Fascinating word. You see, the word is actually Gilgul Otim. If you got an art scroll, it's the fourth line down, first word on the right-hand side. That's if you've got an art scroll. And I say that because the word itself is fascinating to me, and it tells me something that I've been thinking about for a long time. But anyway, let me give it to you heads up. Now, there's lots of arguments on what this head count means, because if you've already said by their name, why do you have to go back and say by their head count? Right? You've already identified that these people they're going to be identified, but you're going to identify them by their head? Well, why say it twice? Why not just simply say I was counting them by their head? Well, there seems to be disagreement. But again, this is in the desert, so you have plenty of room to argue. And so this is some of the things that people began to argue about. The idea here that we begin with is that taking the head is the idea of just simply counting heads. That's the way that you would do it. And if you're playing softball or basketball, let's choose upside, count heads. Each one's got the same number of people on it. That's the easy part. But there was more to it than that. I found an interesting quote from Menachem Schneerson. Menachem Schneerson taught that although the soul descends into a physical body, the soul's head, its spiritual essence, remains aloof and detached from the body. Nonetheless, the soul's head is affected by what the rest of the soul does while here below. By performing God's commandments and fulfilling its mission from within the body, the soul raises its head to a supernal level. By revealing the divine source and the intent of the material reality, the soul attains a higher awareness. So the concept that Menachem is talking about is the idea of the fact that we actually, when they were counting their heads, he was elevating each and every one of them. He was causing them to go up in status. Now, we know that everybody that was there that day was not a rocket scientist, because they didn't have rockets back then. But we do know that there were those that were scholars. And we do understand that there would have been those who were there who, for lack of a better term, were idiots, simpletons, had little understandings. But they counted just as much as the scholar did. Everybody counted. That was the thing that God says. One of the things that we, especially when I was in the church, I had to deal with was the fact that people thought that God didn't need them. God didn't want them. They did not count. when in actuality, that's not what God did. We have our first example of how he looked at everybody and he counted them all. That is quite a difference. When I was a principal in an elementary school, I had 500 kids. I counted them all. Some of them were quadriplegic. Some of them were Down syndrome, but they all counted. They all had a place within the school. And so the same thing holds true with God when he built this tent city and he placed everybody where he wanted to. Now, the quote goes on by a man named Ralbag. Ralbag was Rabbi Levi ben Gershom. Now, he was a French philosopher. He was a Talmudist. He was a mathematician. He was a physician. He was an astronomer in the 13th century. Now, back in the 13th century, science and God were parallel. It's only as when we get into the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries that science seemed to have split away from God. Now, as we're growing closer to the time when the Messiah comes, we're finding that there's more commonality between the two and going back the other way. But there was a split. But back in the days when the Ralbag was actually teaching, he found something fascinating. He said, what's the purpose of identifying their family or their clan through a paternal side, their father's house, and only then the gulatim, the head count? And why does he add the idea that they were to take a tally? Take a tally. Do you understand? It wasn't just the coin. Their name was counted. Literally, their name was written down. When you think about yourself, what is the one thing that we find ourselves wondering? Is my name written in the book of life? That scroll was the book of life. Their names were written down, and they were all recorded and understood. You know, we can understand that the shekel, the half shekel, was important, but it was important for another reason. It was used to purchase the animals for sacrifice. But the tally was important for that man because it made him count. And everybody counted the same. Okay, let's go back to the word gilgulatim, raising of the head. Now, the root of that word is Gilgul. The word Gilgul is a singular, and it speaks of the idea of a cycle or a wheel going around. So why does he refer to this head count as something going around? Why are these heads going in circles? Well, again, for the deeper understanding, I go to the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And Shimon introduces us to the concept, and so does the Arizal. In fact, the Arizal does a better job. He writes it in his book, the Gates of Regeneration. He says, I need to introduce the concept of neshamot, the idea of plural for souls. Souls are to be seen mystically to cycle through lives or incarnations, being attached to different human bodies over time. Which body they associate with depends on their task in their physical world. It is taught that some souls return to complete the spiritual levels of their bodies or of the bodies of their predecessors, and so on. So the concept relates that the wider process of history in Kabbalah is actually the idea of tikkun or messianic rectification. And in a historical dynamic, the ascending lights and descending vessels speak to these generations of cycling through. Now, Solomon wrote the story of a valiant woman. One of the characteristics he used was the idea of being good, a good wife. And the fact that the good wife is so precious. Well, Rabbi Arizal said the reason that they were a good wife was because they had to come back with the husband who didn't quite complete their mission the first time. And they were there to hold us to the fire. or to hold them to the fire so that they would complete their tasks on their second go. That's why my wife had to come back to help me get through this second time around. Amen. That's what she said. The idea is the fact that there is this idea of regeneration or restarting. I looked at the coins for a second and I thought about the coins. I don't know if when I was in college, I had to read the play Silas Marner. I don't know if you've ever read that one. Silas Marner is about a Lutheran who was living in England in a very poor community. And one of the things that he did that went out of his way, because he was a linen maker, he made linen cloths. He went out of his way and he helped the deacon of the church who was sick and in need of help. And so he helped him. Well, in doing so, somebody stole the money out of the church coffers and they planted evidence. And so Silas was considered to be the guilty party. And he had nothing to do with it, but that's beside the point. Well, in the story, the story goes the fact that they accused him of fondling gold coins through his fingers. Shekels is what I thought of when I first thought about it. And in the 19th century, they believed, well, it was more of a Calvinistic kind of a thought, but they believed that the whole thing was going to be identified or by the idea of what do I want to call it? Drawing lots, the use of lots. Well, Silas found out that he was guilty. Now, he wasn't killed and he wasn't imprisoned. He was just told he had to leave. And so he left and he went to another city where he again started up. And this time he vowed to himself he would never, ever get involved with people again. And so things were going along just fine. He was making lots of money. And every evening after he got done with work, he would go home to count his money. Each and every night, he would count the money over and over again, just to know that he had the money. Well, one night, he found a little girl at his door. Well, what do I do with her? Well, he took her in and he began to change. And the money that he began to whittle through his fingers began to be used for the little girl. And he found himself coming back to life, as we would say, into a life that had meaning. And so no longer was he counting money, but he was actually now beginning to count blessings. The little girl was bringing life to his body and life to his spirit. You know, when I think about head counts and when I think about counting is really the lowest denominator of everything that goes on. You're counting a collection. And I think it depends on your view of humanity as to how you look at that count. If a man is basically neutral or worse, I think, well, they missed the point because we're not to be neutral. We're not to be less than that. In fact, what we're supposed to be doing is actually lighting our spark, creating light for others. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Now, I believe that God sees in that half shekel or in that paper that he had our soul, each and every one of us. And his spark that came from God himself, that spark is the potential that's in each and every one of us. We all have potential to do something. That's part of what goes on. That's why we were put to this earth. Life is to endeavor to realize that we have a spark within us, and we may lead a full and righteous life and barely scratch the surface of all the things that God has put in us. You see, God is limitless. He doesn't make junk. Now, as we go through this whole idea, there are some people that spend their whole life wasted. But for some reason, towards the end, all of a sudden, a spark is lit. And you know, even at late times, even when you're near the end, the concept is that you can burst into a flame. God counts us not to know our number. He already knows that. And we would need to do it to be in contact with the essence of our souls, which he obviously is. He would count us to accentuate our soul of souls, our hayah, our life, to give expression to the essence and to make it more accessible to others. Now, when God counts us, he is stimulating the highest and loftiest part of our being, the spark of divinity that he put within us. With that, I gave you 30 minutes. That's enough. Anybody got comments or thoughts that they would like to add? Go for it.